Whether I find myself planning a railfan outing in advance or hitting the road with 5 minutes notice, my adventures usually fall into one of three categories. I'm either hanging out trackside enjoying whatever the railroad sends my way, I've gone to a hot spot in search of as many trains as possible, or I've dedicated my efforts to chasing something specific. The chase is by far the most involved form of railfanning, aimed at witnessing the spotlight train traverse as many desirable scenes as possible. On May 12, 2021, I was out on the mainline metal for a change, engaged in full-fledged chase mode on CSX's Florida S-Line. Nothing like a little warm-up train though, as local A782 throttled north out of the Wildwood Yard. I had been sitting around waiting for about an hour and a half prior to 782's departure, but things got exciting real quick. The main event quickly took precedence as CSX ES44AH number 3194 came gliding into view. .3194 has been painted into a special Pride in Service paint scheme, specifically honoring our nation's law enforcement officers. The black, white, and deep blue paint, along with the many decals and ear-piercing Leslie air horn, make 3194 an absolute thrill to see in action. I was psyched as the GEVO eased train Q453 into a pit stop at Wildwood Yard along its route from Waycross to Miami. ET44AH number 3355 was performing the day's distributed power duties, 85 cars behind the Pride in Service locomotive. That number is about to shrink drastically, as Q453 was tasked with dropping the first 59 cars off in Wildwood. This meant stopping on the main to uncouple the setouts and shoving them into the yard. CSX 3194 was just another YN3B GEVO until it was unveiled on August 22, 2019 in its Pride in Service scheme. Repainted in Huntington, West Virginia, 3194 is known as the Spirit of Our Law Enforcement and is the third Pride in Service locomotive completed by CSX. After I had moved about a mile down the road from my first stop, I was sitting adjacent to the Wildwood Yard where 3194 was making its drop. The weeds were kind of annoying, but what better way to gain some elevation than throwing the top down and hopping in the trunk? With ES44AH number 911 dedicated to first responders and 1776 to our armed forces, the Spirit of Our Law Enforcement is an excellent addition to the Pride in Service fleet. Following its 2019 debut, 3194 made quite a stir as it led CSX train Q693 from Russell, Kentucky to Rice Yard in Waycross, Georgia. Upon arrival, the Spirit of Our Law Enforcement was quickly sent to storage, joined by that of our first responders and armed forces. The three beautiful engines sat hidden and motionless for 18 months, save 2 appearances at public events in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Everything changed on Valentine's Day 2021 when CSX 911, 3194, and 1776 were sent out of Rice Yard on Q410 to Selkirk. Following their return to service, all 3 Pride in-service locomotives were captive to Southeastern power pools until halfway through summer of 2021. It was an extraordinary treat for area rail fans, and I was excited to make the most of it as I had briefly returned to Florida from school in North Carolina. After watching the switching in Wildwood, I decided to leapfrog the train to Bushnell as I eagerly waited to see my most wanted locomotive of 2021. Following the 59-car drop-off in Wildwood, Q453 was still about 140 cars long. The Miami-bound Manifest would have a straight shot from here to the A-line in Lakeland, which I had figured was gonna give me a run for my money. Luckily, the dispatcher had Q453 running on approaches through Lacoochee for what I'm assuming was a meet with Q452. This allowed me ample time to watch from the trunk once more as I sat at Owensboro Road, south of the Lacoochee Pass Track. Q453 left Waycross with 85 mixed cars, bracketed on each end by a locomotive. Over 100 cars were added behind the DPU in Baldwin, and the 59 cars set out in Wildwood meant that 3355 was now only 26 car lengths behind 3194. The DPU's placement seemed awfully skewed to me, but I am just a rail fan. I split after the DPU and managed to beat both 453 and the Afternoon Thunderstorm to the Dade City Museum. This is a popular spot to train watch on the S-Line, and I was half expecting to see some other rail fans gathered here for Q453. That was not the case. In fact, I didn't encounter another rail fan all day long. Very surprising considering I was chasing a Pride in-service locomotive. Due to their long-term captivity in southeastern service, the Pride in-service engines had become somewhat commonplace, so flocks of rail fans giving chase were no longer the norm. I was perfectly fine being a flock of one, as both the southbound train and Thunderstorm closed in while I frantically threw the soft top back over the Wrangler. There wasn't much else worth watching after the DPU, especially when there was a pacing opportunity to be had on old US 301. I was still in front of the Storm and 453 by Richland, but not by much. With little time, I opted for the handheld shot, made possible by my camcorder's awesome stabilization technology. Approaching Vitus Junction, 453 was told to take it easy by the dispatcher, as the next available crew wasn't set to arrive at the Stokes Pass track until 3:30 p.m., and it was only 1:15. Stokes is a couple miles south of Richland's Vitus Junction and only accessible by railroad personnel. The slow-moving 140-something car train was in between me and the main road, so I wouldn't get another roll-by prior to the crew change. With this in mind, I decided to take full advantage of watching 453 at length, ambling through the farmlands against the stormy Florida backdrop. On the other side of Stokes sits Kathleen, where I figured I'd hang out and have lunch while waiting for the crew change. I always like poking around and finding spots off the beaten path, and thought I struck the motherlode as I wandered through the brush and towards the right-of-way. The foliage turned out to be pretty intrusive, so I kept looking, where I finally did strike gold. In between Kathleen and Lakeland, the Vitus subdivision soars over Interstate 4, an iconic location I've passed under all my life. I quickly decided this was my next spot, and hung around until perhaps the most on-time CSX crew change I had ever witnessed took place. I figured a 3:30 call meant the train would be rolling by 4 at the earliest, but ate my words when Q453 announced a clear signal through Kathleen at 3:34 p.m. Q453 was back underway, for about 20 minutes. The train stopped again at Lakeland Junction, where the Vitus subdivision splits onto the A line. This is where I decided to end my awesome chase of 3194, but not without a couple more close-ups of the incredible details on the locomotive. While I bid adieu to the spirit of our law enforcement, I wasn't done running around just quite yet. 2 trains were moving towards the nearby Winston Yard, and I arrived on scene in time to see 0738 backing their small train off the A line and down the yard lead. I sat in the car and didn't think much of this move until I saw a big red EMD, and deciding watching through the windshield just wouldn't do. Sweet, sometimes getting sidetracked pays off, pun intended. Canadian Pacific SD70 ACUs are attractive locomotives, and I was pleasantly surprised to have seen the 7026. This marked the second time I had seen a CP ACU, with the first being on 0713, which, funnily enough, was coming up from the south. 0713 was so close yet so far. 0738 required some headroom to build train Q604, a nightly manifest up to Waycross. I was told this work is done under the 0501 symbol, but it's all the same to me as they were still using the Canadian power set. Both of CP's rebuilt engine models were on full display here in Winston, as one from each manufacturer slowly doubled Q604's consist within the yard. Something that's always struck me as odd about Canadian locomotives is how they have two different classifications. You'll notice that under 7026's numbers, it reads DRF-43 alongside SD70ACU. For some reason, Canadian railroads add this second designation to signify what I believe is best described as the locomotive's main purpose. DRF stands for diesel road freight, followed by the horsepower in hundreds. 4,300 horses in 7026's case, and 4,400 for the 8165, thus making it a DRF-44. As 0501 continued to build Q604, I decided to head for home. I was thrilled with what the day had brought me, a train meet to start off with, both of Canadian Pacific's rebuild models, and an awesome chase of CSX's Spirit of Our Law Enforcement. Thanks for railfanning with me today. I hope you enjoyed this fantastic day in Central Florida as much as I did.